I have a joke. I'm not going to tell it to you, but I have a very long joke that I learned when I was 9 from a schoolboy, a friend of mine. And it's an American joke. I don't know where he got it from. And I enjoy telling it to white Americans because it goes on for about 5 minutes and they think it's going to be racist. And I see them getting more and more uncomfortable as I tell it because I can tell they're thinking, when the punchline comes, this could be racist, and then I'm going to have laughed, and I'm not going to. And then the punchline comes, and it's not racist. They don't really laugh. They just sort of, you see them just sort of feeling completely relieved. And I call this talk "Why All Schools Are Public Schools" because I didn't want you to have that feeling of discomfort as I went through it, because I could just as easily have called it "Why No Schools Are Public Schools." Or why it just doesn't matter whether schools are public schools or private schools. But if I called them that, then I think you'd have been anxious as I talk, and I didn't want to do that to you. When it gets to the punchline, you'll feel okay. Okay? That's I think. But the ideas here, and it's very preliminary, but the ideas here come out of really 3 sets of experiences of mine. So one is arguments with left-wingers, and their US experiences. I don't have these experiences with people outside the US. But one is left-wingers who advocate strongly for more equality within the public schools, but somehow resist applying those standards to private schools. They say, no, that's the private sector. You can't do anything to the private sector. And I want to say, no, it's just rich people spending money. I mean, it's like we can do stuff to that. The second is arguments with left-wingers in the US who are opposed, and this is really people in my neighborhood, I try not to be rude, who are very opposed to a school voucher system that is in place in Milwaukee, which is a local city local to us, which targets low-income children who are in pretty bad schools. And it pays for them, the government pays for those kids to go to private schools based on the choice of parents. Everybody in my neighborhood opposes that scheme except me. I actually oppose it now too, but everybody, until recently I didn't. They changed it. But everyone opposes it. But everybody in my neighborhood bought their house in my neighborhood because the local government schools are the best local government schools in the city. So they used their privilege of choice through the housing market, but they don't want poor Black and Latino people being able to use the choice that the government is willing to give them through just choosing schools. I get very uncomfortable with that. And the final thing, and I'll come back to this in a minute, is the difficulty that people have in deciding whether charter schools, so I'll describe charter schools in a moment, but deciding whether charter schools is a special kind of school that are run by non-profits and sometimes by for-profits, but mildly regulated and paid for entirely by the government. Deciding whether those charter schools are public schools or private schools. Often what people do is they just call them charter schools to avoid it. And I guess the payoff is I don't care whether they're private schools or public schools. It just doesn't matter to me whether they're public or private. What matters to me is what contribution they make to achieving the goals, the public goals that we should have for the system. All right, I'm going to skip. I can tell that I'm going to go too long unless I do some skipping. So let's skip that. So here's the standard way I think that people, certainly in the UK and the US, or certainly in the US, make between public and private schools. They think, well, public schools are government-funded, government-provided, and the government decides what students go to which schools. Whereas with private schools, they're privately funded, usually by by tuition, privately provided. There's a private provider, which isn't the government, and they have full discretion on admissions. They can let anybody they want in, and they can rule anybody they want out. Now, of course, already you will see that the public this definition of the public is already a bit uncomfortable, because the government sort of allocates students to public schools, but it sort of doesn't, right? What the government doesn't do is say, it doesn't matter where you live, your kid is going to go to the school we tell you it's going to go to. What the government does is it says, if you can buy a house in the neighbourhood which has the best public schools in the city, then you get to go there. And if you can't afford a house, or if you're renting and your landlord kicks you out, then we decide where your kids go to school. We decide. But for upper middle class and middle class parents, they get to decide where their kids go to school within this framework that we've set up. Okay. Don't worry about that. That's just going to happen all the time. So there are some unclear cases, and there always have been unclear cases. The voucher schools that I mentioned are unclear cases with the distinction I've just given. Direct grant schools, those are schools that we no longer have in the UK, but I've lived in the UK and the US, so I sort of jump back and forth. Direct grant schools were schools which were privately run, but they got direct grants. Some kids went because their parents paid the fees, but some kids passed exams and the government would pay for them. And the government would pay for them regardless of whether the parents could afford the fees or not. If you passed the exams, you got to go, and if you didn't pass the exams, you got to go if your parents could pay. Assisted places scheme was very similar. Almost all Dutch schools don't fit this. In the Netherlands, something like 87% of children attend schools which are run by private foundations, but paid for with government money, and regulated actually quite stringently by the government in terms of the kinds of curriculum they have. So already we've got unclear cases. Let's look at charter schools. Charter schools are sort of one of my animating concerns. So we have, do I have the percentage? No, I don't. 2.5 million children in the US, I think this is 2013, attend charter schools. There are 6,400 schools. They're in 42 states, though they are very heavily concentrated in some states and especially in some cities. Almost all the children in New Orleans now go to charter schools. Milwaukee, Chicago have become very large charter areas. And these are schools which are run, as I said, sometimes by non-profits and sometimes by for-profit companies. And are subject to regulation which is not the same regulation as the rest of the public schools, what I'm going to refer to as traditional public schools, not the same regulations as traditional public schools. Because there are 42 states, there are 42 sets of regulations. That is 42 sets of departures from the regulations of the 42 states. And in fact, in some states, including my own, there are two kinds of charter schools. So we actually have one kind of charter school is regulated one way, another kind is regulated another way. What they have in common is that they're regulated more lightly. They have more freedom, more autonomy than traditional public schools do. Oh, gosh. Okay, so I've said all that. Good. And there's one rule which is really neat, and it's really neat because it allows them to be studied quite rigorously. That is, it actually opens them to rigorous scrutiny, which is that they must admit by lottery. If you have 100 places and you have 150 children applying for those places, you are not allowed to choose which ones come. What you do is you put 150 names in a pot. I'm sure they do it by computer, but imagine that you have 150 names in a pot and you draw out 100 names randomly, and then they're the ones who come to your school. Right? You are not allowed to decide. Now, of course, you will say, and you're absolutely right, anybody who knows anything about marketing knows that there are ways of skewing the pool. And there are ways of skewing the pool, and most schools I know of do some of that. Interestingly, some schools try and skew the pool so that they've got really more advantaged, well-off kids, Others, a very small number in inner cities, try and skew the pool so that they pretty much only get disadvantaged kids, because that's part of their social mission, right? Whether they skew the pool or not, the great thing about lottery is it means that you can compare, if you've got the money, you can track the performance of the kids who are in the school, and you can track the performance of the kids who didn't go to the school but were in the lottery, and you can compare what happens to them, right? And that enables you to say something about what the effects of being in that school rather than a traditional public school are. I'm not going to say anything about those studies, actually. Well, I'll say one thing about the study. So I just say I'm not a partisan in this debate about charter schools. It's a raging debate. Most of the people I know are strongly opposed to charter schools of all kinds. Some of the people I know are strongly in favour of charter schools of pretty much all kinds. And I'm in neither camp. But I have scrutinised the literature on charter schools pretty in more detail than I think is proper for somebody who has a life. And my read of the evidence is that on average charter schools don't do any better or any worse than the traditional public schools, except they seem to do a little bit better for low-income and black and Latino kids. Just a little bit better. Not enough that you'd bet the house on them, right? But just a little bit better on average. Okay. So, what I want to do now, I have not been keeping my own time, so I'm relying on you to do that.
I've done 15 minutes now.
I've done 15, so I've got about another 20.
Yeah, another 15 minutes.
Good. I'll try not to use the whole 20. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe 4 schools to you, and this is a kind of intuition pump, right? I'm trying to get you to think about what makes a school public and what makes a school not public. And by the way, there'll be a 5th school later. The 5th school, these 4 schools are all actually based on real schools. The 5th school is a total fantasy. So, let's start with St. James School. I'm going to leave them up very short time. There's a lot of words on the board, but I'll just quickly go through them. The first one is St. James. It's located in a city with a substantial Muslim population. It's got a governing body, four local Roman Catholic Church, 1 from the local mosque, 4 from the city council, 2 parents elected by the PTO. Same curricular requirements as all government-funded schools. It's totally government-funded, this school. And the students have daily prayer sessions, but parents can opt them out of them. If the school is oversubscribed, it gets to select the first 30% of children from a lottery, including only applicants from Roman Catholic families, and then for the remaining 70%, the school must select from a lottery of all other applicants, weighted heavily toward local residents. The city schools have a 30% free and reduced lunch. That's free and reduced lunch. That's the frankly not very good, but it's the proxy that people use in these studies and in talking about schooling for poverty. It's not a great proxy for poverty for all sorts of reasons, but it's the best that we have. And St. James also has a 30% free and reduced lunch rate. There's no union contract in the school, but the state government specifically allows the school to unionise. So some charter schools, you're not allowed to unionize. And actually soon in my own state of Wisconsin, next year, no teachers will be allowed to unionize at all. They've removed the law has been changed so that teachers, public servants other than firefighters and police officers are not allowed to unionize. They left the police officers and firefighters, they left them the permission because they thought that then they would support the bill, which they didn't, which is good for them. So now CLR James School. Funded entirely by the state government, run by the principal, chosen by a superintendent accountable to a directly elected school board. Curricular requirements are minimal. The school must take all and only students from the local neighbourhood. The district has a 30% free and reduced lunch rate for elementary. CLR James has a 3% free and reduced lunch rate. Teachers and non-management staff are represented by a closed shop union. Now, Bob James School. Run by a private, non-profit foundation devoted to music education, obviously, because it's Bob James School. It's entirely secular, but a school of choice in a system in which all schools are funded through vouchers. This is a voucher school. And every parent's required to enter the lottery. Students are selected by lottery. The city has a 30% free and reduced lunch rate, so does Bob James School. And there's a curriculum that determines pretty much, I mean, this is the core versus the extras. So the idea is that the core curriculum takes up 60% of the school day, and then you're allowed to do other things. And it must report student outcomes. Final one, for the moment, is Sally James School. If there's anybody English in the audience, and they can get all 4 of these, I'll be really impressed. Everybody English in the audience will get the 5th one, what the names mean. So, funded through philanthropic donations and tuition fees charged to families, run by a non-profit. It's required to abide by a curriculum that determines 60% of the school day, consistently oversubscribed, and it doesn't expand, but it selects on a lottery, weighted to produce socioeconomic mix like that of the city in which it is located. So it has a free and reduced lunch rate of 30%. And those children are funded through generous philanthropy, right? It does not try and skew its pool. It tries to get a complete mix, a mix that is just like that of the city that it inhabits. And it makes sure that those children get funded. And it's inspected by government inspectors, faces fines and possibly closure if its value-added outcomes fall below a certain level. Okay, so we've got 4 schools there. I'm sorry, I should have done a handout, really, and then you could have spent your time just sort of staring at them. But I didn't. So when I present this, these to Americans who are broadly in favour of public schools, they think, they identify CLR James as the only public school. The rest of them are not public schools because they're not run by the government. But CLR James, if that's true, if CLR James is the only public school, public has no normative significance at all. Because what CLR James actually does is it serves the interests of the more advantaged, quite deliberately serves the interests of the more advantaged people in the city. And I will tell you what was happened in that district. I promise you this is what's happened in the district, and I promise you, because this is based on a real school in a real district, and so I know exactly what's happened. There's a neighbouring school which has a 70% free and reduced lunch rate. Right? A neighbouring school has a 70% free and reduced lunch rate. And recently it was proposed to change the boundaries so that both schools would have roughly the same free and reduced lunch rate. And that proposal was shot down. And it was shot down because the parents of this school said, forget it, we're not going to put up with that. And I think very sensible, I'm not accusing anybody of being corrupt or anything, very sensible people on the school board thought, if we do this, those people will pull out of the public schools, they'll go private, and most likely what they'll do is they'll move to a neighbouring suburban district which has 0 poverty, and then their taxes will go to that district, and the kids in this school will end up with less money spent on them. So they pandered to those parents. I think that was probably, I think it was probably the right thing to do. But if you're going to say that this is a public school, and you're not going to say that Sally James is a public, was it Sally James? CLA? Sally James is a public school, I don't think public has any normative significance for you at all. So what you could do is you could add some criteria. You can say, well, population has to reflect the diversity of the community in order for it to be public, or population has to reflect the socioeconomic diversity of the region, because obviously if it just reflects the socioeconomic diversity of the community, and the community is not very socioeconomically diverse, as again in the US, most communities are not. So most districts are either very high poverty or very low poverty. It's very hard to find a school district like mine. I mean, the school district I'm in has about a 40% poverty rate, which is roughly the poverty, it's probably about 30% in the country as a whole. But almost no school districts have populations like that. Most school districts have populations of 10% poverty or less, and of 80% poverty or more. Why? Because we're a highly segregated, the housing is highly segregated in our society. There's nothing that schools and school districts can do about that. It's a fact that they have to live with. But it means that any given school that just reflects the socioeconomic diversity of the community is not going to be public in a sense that I'd want it to be public if I were trying to add in these criteria. All right, so we could have these criteria. Are there 6? Yes, there are, so I don't need to go any further. Good. Government provided, government funded, no religion. Very important for Americans, not for me, that a school has no religion in it in order for it to be public. They do not like the idea that you'd have religion in a school and you'd fund it. Me, I'm perfectly happy to have the government fund religious schools as long as it holds them to all sorts of regulation or that it chooses them wisely. I don't have a problem with that, but that makes me un-American. Everybody doesn't want religion in public schools. Even people who like religious schools don't want religion in public schools. People who like public schools don't want religion in public schools. No discretion over admissions, reflects diversity, is equally good for all demographic groups. So just to say that last condition, so you might have a pretty representative school, and actually my children, my eldest has just graduated from high school, and she attended a school, a high school which was about 40% free and reduced lunch. So you might think, well, at least Brighouse, good old Brighouse, he sends his kid to a representative school, No. That's not true. It's a school which neglects the education of the 40% of kids who are on free and reduced lunch. Those kids are at the school, sure, but they're assigned the least good teachers. They're assigned the most inexperienced teachers. They're not in the same classes as the kids who... they're not in the same classes as the more advantaged kids. You should have heard when there was a proposal to make 9th grade English a class that everybody should take. You should have heard the Obama voting left-wing liberal upper middle class parents around my area and how much they fussed. No, we can't have 9th grade English be we need electives, we need Shakespeare, because if you have Shakespeare, then your kid can choose into Shakespeare, and the poor kids won't choose into Shakespeare, and then you get to have your kid not be in classes with the poor kids, but you don't have to admit that what you're doing is segregating, right, because you've done it through choice. Am I starting to rant? Sorry, I do rant a bit, but I try not to. Okay, so let's go to Sidney James School. Come on, who knows who Sidney James is?
Carry on.
Yes, that's right. Sidney James, the great Sidney James. So it's fully government funded, it's managed by central government and civil servants, it abides by national curriculum, its population is drafted from the local region, it reflects exactly the diversity of that region, which in turn perfectly is representative of the entire country's population, and it's equally good for all well-defined demographic groups, right? It might not be as good for the people who play cricket as it is for the people who play American football, but, you free and reduced lunch, boys, girls, race, you name it, any sensible, cricket, that is a demographic group, but, any sensibly defined demographic group, equally good for all of them. So Sidney James gets to be a public school on my 6 criteria. The big problem with that is that then no school's a public school, because Sidney James School is a fantasy school, okay? I mean, there might be a school like that somewhere among the, whatever it is, 100,000 schools in the US, so there might be one public school in the US according to these criteria, and I promise you it's not called Sidney James School if it is. But no, there are no public schools according to this. So this is why one of the thoughts that you might have is, well, that's why I could have given it the title, No Schools are Public Schools. But why aren't the last 3 criteria enough? Why isn't no discretion over admissions, reflects diversity, equally good for all demographic groups enough? Why do we need government provided, government funded, and let's forget about no religion? I think that it seems fetishistic to insist on any of the other criteria once you have those 3 criteria in place. Once you've got no discretion over admissions and diversity and it being equally good for everybody, I don't care. I don't care about the rest of the stuff. And I think caring about the rest of the stuff would seem odd to me. How long do I have?
10 minutes.
Oh, well, that's loads. I won't use it all. Good. So this is how I prefer you think about it, okay? This is how I want you to think about whether a school is public or not. And on what I'm going to tell you, all schools are public schools. what I want you to do first is think about what you want from a schooling system. So, you talked about, what we should be talking about, what we actually want from a schooling system. And that should be the focus of our attention. And so I'll just make 4 proposals here. I think we want all of these things from a schooling system. We want it to produce a productive labour force, and by productive labour force I do not mean people who sit there making widgets and do whatever they're told by employers. I mean people who produce social good. Some widget producing is social bad, and some activity that doesn't get paid at all is social good. Lots of people contribute to productivity without ever getting paid for doing so. I don't just mean the people who work for employers who don't pay them, although there's them too. We want democratically competent citizens, people who are capable of participating generously in political and civic life. We want people who can make their own judgments, who are not bound by the judgments by the way that their parents or their communities think of things, but are able to make judgments on their own about how to live their lives and about what's valuable. And we want a system, I think this is really important, we want a system that contributes to social justice in the right kind of way. And I have written lots of things about this, but 4 words are good enough, really. It benefits the less advantaged. 5 words. It prioritizes benefit of the less advantaged. So that's, I think, what we should want from a schooling system. And then I think what we should do is we should think of all schools as public schools. They're all obliged to play a coordinated role in a system that provides what we want from a school system. Just because a school is a for-profit school, or just because a school is Eton, I'm sure being Indian you've heard of Eton's familiar in India, right? Yeah, it's where we get our governments from, it doesn't make any, especially if it's Eton, where we get our governments from. I mean, it better bloody well be playing a coordinated role in a system that provides what we want from a school system. It better be taking those kids who we're going to stupidly make our government and turning them into people who are capable of really delivering and serving the population. It doesn't do that. Or you can make your own judgment about that. But it doesn't get a get out of jail free card because it's private, because it's Eton. Nor do the for-profit schools, nor do the NGO schools, nor do the schools that the Roman Catholic Church runs, nor do the schools that a Muslim mosque runs, nor do the government schools. Just because you're a government public school, you do not get out of having to participate in this in an appropriate way. And any school that fails to make an appropriate contribution is a failing school, whether it's traditionally called public, traditionally called private, whatever criteria it meets. If it doesn't do this, it's not a failing school. Now, I envisage a system which has some diversity of provision, because if every school were exactly the same, I don't think that schools would be able to do a really good job of contributing to this system. I expect diversity of provision, because I think you need diversity in order to spark innovation, in order to get the dissemination of good practices, etc. I have no idea what this... so you might say all schools are public schools, or you might say whether a school is public or private is not the interesting issue. It's how well it serves the public purposes for education. That's what we want to be focused on. Now, I'm not denying that there are private purposes, that there are private interests at stake. There are private interests at stake, and they're important. Children and parents have an interest in schools not disrupting their relationships, their familial relationships. They have an interest in, parents have an interest in sharing values with their children. Schools that try to take children away from their parents culturally are doing something prima facie wrong. If their parents are, Nazis in the Ku Klux Klan, then maybe it's doing the right thing. But there is a bad thing going along with the right thing it's doing. By and large, it's doing the wrong thing. And children have interests in being educated and becoming independent, which are private interests. They have a private interest that, as well as the public having an interest. But that doesn't make any difference to the private-public divide, because first of all, many of children's private interests are included in the way that I've defined the public interests, purposes of education. And the other is that these interests, these private interests, are as urgent among those who cannot afford private schooling as they are among those who can afford private schooling. In fact, by and large, they're more urgent for those who can't afford private schooling than they are for those who can afford private schooling, right? Because people who can't afford private schooling, by and large, are more vulnerable to various kinds of bad things happening to their private interests than people who can afford private schooling. And so I don't think that... I think private interests have to be attended to properly by all schools, but public and private. Okay, so I'm going to finish with my concluding comment. I can't remember what it is, but I know it'll be interesting. No, it isn't really. All schools are obliged to serve public legitimate purposes. All schools are obliged to serve legitimate private purposes, and that's without regard to who funds, regulates, or chooses them. So I want to focus on what schools do, on whether they contribute appropriately to the public mission, and think hard about that. And whether we call them public or private isn't so important. The reason I said that, you know, the punchline should make you feel less anxious, what I'm saying is that even if you have private schools that you do not fund and you just allow there to be private schools, they're still open to scrutiny and regulation. They're open to scrutiny and regulation. You should regulate and scrutinize them in the best way that you can in order to ensure they're contributing appropriately to the public goals. And you should do that to public schools too.
Two hands in the neighborhood. 3, 4. Okay. Since I cited those two first.
Can I also say, you know, if you want to respond to anything anybody says, you don't. I don't want to be on my own.
All right.
And if I want to respond.
And you too. Yeah. Any of the three.
All right, thanks for that, Harry. So I have a question, and I have an observation. So in your formulation about, you know, what would make a school public, you say that all schools are obliged to play a coordinated role, right, in a system that provides what we want from a school system. So I think, depending on your answer to what you mean by a coordinated role, that you're tracking precisely the distinction I made some years ago between a public system of schools and schools that are individually public in the conventional sense that you dismantled. Right. So you seem to be coming round to my view, is the observation. You need a mic.
Yeah.
You need the mic.
Then I'll come to you. Okay,
All
go
right.
ahead. Please.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have one short question about the distinction between public and private purposes of education. I was wondering why you are going to define becoming an independent person as a private interest, becoming the autonomous of person who is capable of choice and autonomy as a private interest, but not as a public one, because it's obvious, at least for me, that at least a democratic society cannot function without having autonomous, independent citizens.
Yeah. And then forth on this side. After that.
Okay, thank you. I think I've tried to put this point to you before many years ago, but I'm going to try it again. So it seems to me that the worries you have about the way concerns about justice are not met in certain schools, and yet they are in others, and how that perhaps problematizes some of the public-private distinction. My worry is that those issues of justice are not actually the result primarily of policies of school governance and school provision. They're the result of the fact that we live in a particular political, economic system in which educational achievement and performance is causally linked to unequal position in the socio-economic system. So I want to say to you, well, if you can say, let's have a fantasy school, I would say, well, why stop at a school within the existing socio-economic system? Why not acknowledge that the problems are with the system itself? And let's start from, you know, the exercise that you gave us, the sort of thought experiment about what do we want from a system of schooling. Why can't that be a fantasy? Why can't we say, you know, if we lived in a society in which we didn't have these vast socio-economic inequalities, in which educational experience and performance was not causally linked to differential socioeconomic positions, then what kind of education system would we want? Why do we have to start from leaving everything in place and then tweak the provision of state schooling so that it matches a Rawlsian notion of justice? That's where I'm coming from.
I guess I'm going to extend the last speaker's question in a way. Can you hear me? Yeah, I guess I'm going to extend in a different way. Instead of talking of, when we talk of public, when we pose a problem in terms of public and private purposes, it becomes very neat and clean. You know, you can easily identify with the last three and say, yeah, great. But when you start looking at who can actually provide those public purposes pragmatically in a given context, then it becomes much muddier, right? How can, and economics has, you know, spent as a discipline enough time in trying to see how private can provide public goods, and answers are not yet clear. How can you expect a system or a way of doing things which is genetically programmed for profits and market share and competition and such, which are antithesis in a sense of the public good, serve public purposes without convoluting too many things?
So I'm going to go in reverse order just because I don't want, yours is the question I'm most likely to forget because I didn't write it down properly. So my answer to that is just, I think Gurpreet answered that earlier. So first of all, I am very skeptical that for-profit schools can play, can or would, certainly in the US, maybe in other places, context matters, but in the US I'm very skeptical that they can play any sort of role in a system that does what I want the system to do. Okay, so that's for exactly the reasons that you give, right? But profit is built into the whole system, right? People have to purchase land to build schools on. They contract with building companies to build the schools. They contract with textbook companies to buy the textbooks. It's not as though profit is sort of not involved in the enterprise at all. It is involved in the enterprise. And teachers and principals quite properly have their own private interests as well as their interest in doing their job well, right? So teachers quite properly have an interest in not working an 80-hour week, right? It's quite reasonable for them not to want to do that. And in the margins, there is going to be a conflict between private and public interests there. I say that as somebody who lives with somebody who works in schools and, you know, at times certainly has been working 80-hour weeks. It's not good for you, but it might be good for the schools that you do it. So now working backwards. So one answer to your question, but I don't have total confidence in this, is that I suspect we'd want roughly the same. I mean, certainly the public purposes of education I have in mind are the same public purposes I would have in mind if we lived in a just society, right? I don't see there's a those are the purposes that we should have. Maybe not regardless completely of society, but certainly in a society that was just, I would want those things to be achieved. It's just a different enterprise. So there's one enterprise which is figuring out what a just society should look like and thinking about how that might work out and what an education system would be in that kind of society. And that's a good enterprise. That's a good intellectual enterprise, an important one. And there's the enterprise of thinking about, given certain parameters that are not going to change within, you make a judgment about the time frame within which they're not going to change. And I don't believe that the basic, I believe that America is going to be a capitalist, unequal, unjust society for the next 100 years. It might not be that, it's great when your expectations well, it's not always great, but, in this case it would be great if my expectations were upset, but that's what I expect. And so there's an enterprise, it's a different enterprise of figuring out what you should want from from schools, even if it has the same results, given those assumptions. So I do both things, but here I did the one rather than the other. And I think it's important that people do the second thing because I have that expectation. So for practical purposes, it matters. Next one. So public and private, autonomy is, I put it under both lists. So, people who can make the independent judgments was under my public purposes of education list. And then it was also included as a private interest of children. It is something they have a private interest in. It's good for them, independently of whether it's good for society. It's also something we have a public interest in because it's good for us, independently of whether it's good for them, right? Maybe competent democratic citizens may be a little bit different. I'm not sure how good it is for somebody to be a competent democratic citizen, but it's really good for other people. And so there it's the balance is much more on the public than the private. Finally, so I want to say something. So yeah, I do, I agree with that. But I want to say something that is either clarifying or mystifying. And I don't know which, because I haven't said it yet. There's one sort of model on which you think, okay, we've got a coordinating agent, which is coordinating things, and then my role is to play. What I should do is I should play the role that I'm best suited to within that coordinated system. So I think I've got a really good dean in my college, and a really good administration, and they set rules, and then they figure out what I should be doing, and I do that within the rules. But suppose I had a really bad dean and a really bad administration, and they refused to coordinate things in the right way. Well, then I think I would still... So then I wouldn't be able to play a role in a coordinated system. So that imposes a huge burden on me, because then I have to think, okay, other people aren't doing what they ought to be doing. The dean hasn't set things up the right way. Now I have to figure out what I should be doing. And what I should be doing then might be much more burdensome than what I should be doing if everything all coordinated well. I think that's true of our contribution to, for all Americans, they have to figure out, because their government promotes injustice and inequality around the world, and therefore they're not able to use their government's role as a coordinating role, they have to figure out for themselves, oh God, there isn't this coordinating body. I have to figure out what I have to do in the light of that to make the contribution that is the right moral contribution that I have to make to making the world a more just and good place. And of course, what we generally do is we forgive ourselves our sins and do less than we should.
We can take 2 more questions, that's all. 1, 2 there. 1 here. And 1 behind at this side, on the left side.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. And I think my question might be a repetition of what many of them have asked. But I want to ask, just out of a lack of understanding and a lack of exposure to this kind of a debate regarding when we talk about public and private in education, is that when we are talking about this, shouldn't we actually talk about how education as a good is different from any other good that procures or that is liable to procurement of mercantile or commercial profits. Shouldn't this debate, or shouldn't we talk about this first, then get into the realities of it? I mean, this is, I mean, ideationally, shouldn't we conceptualize what kind of a good education is, and whether it is actually similar or what differentiates it from the commercial goods which are liable to procurement of profit or not, I mean, the manufacturing and all those kind of understandings of any good. So this is a simple question.
Yeah, that side, last one.
Yeah, Bihar Sahib, you will have to give me a minute because this formulation worries me a little bit. This formulation, which both the speakers have put forward, they are very close to each other. That worries me a little bit in the Indian context. So you will have to give me a minute to explain that.
Go ahead.
And so, you see,
you will probably lighten my task. Go ahead.
You see, at the level of sort of principles, if public and for-profit market, and I am emphasizing that, for-profit market-run schools, if both can deliver the same kind of public-spirited education, then who could have a problem with that? So we would all happily agree. Then what are we really discussing is that if we really think 4 criteria of education which Professor Brighouse gave us just now, people who can make their own judgment, who participate generously in the democratic citizenship, who are critical, I have forgotten that, but if we think that the private education can deliver that, and we can make through the regulation private education, private schools to deliver that, then perhaps there is no contradiction, there is no problem, there is no debate. The real issue is under what kind of market and social and political conditions a private school running for profit can deliver those goods. And the problem is here that so far, the way these regulations from the government, the way the schools have been running world over, they do not see that promise that they are concerned with those values and that they are delivered. But then another argument emerges, but are the public schools, so-called government schools, do deliver that? May not be. But then the government is duty-bound in a democratic state to deliver that. So what should we be doing in a country like India? Should we be simply saying, since government doesn't deliver, private doesn't deliver, therefore it's okay? Or should we be saying that this is the duty of the government, first they should deliver in their own system, and if they can regulate, then they should regulate in the private, or they should check this private thing. Because otherwise, this argument gives a license to a government which gets out of its responsibility into privatizing education. That is my first hazily formulated question. The second is more direct, and I might be making a mistake in that, Professor Brighouse. I remember long back, in one of your writings, I hope that was yours and I'm not sort of mixing up with someone else, that when you were arguing about the faith-based schools, then you listed 5 criteria. That if they fulfill these criteria, then they can get government funding. I remember 2 or 3 of them. One of them was that the faith-based schools also inform about other religious choices within their own religion teaching. So which means that if I'm running a Hindu school, if I want to get government funding, then I should also inform my students about the Islamic teaching or Christian teaching or Sikh teaching or both teaching. That's number 1. Another, you said that they should imagine a community of believers which is open, which means that one can enter, I can become a Hindu, and I can get out. I say, I'm no more a Hindu, I'm a Christian or Muslim or whatever, or I'm atheist. So, now you said that this is all right if the school is religious schools. But isn't it contradiction in terms? Religious schools actually do not inform about the other religious choices, and many of them are not open in this sense. Therefore, aren't we sort of painting a rosy picture and trying to brush away the hard questions, brushing the hard questions under the carpet? Sorry, Bihar Sahib, I took a long time, but I thought this is needed to be said. Thank you.
Okay, but in this egalitarian conference, I can't let Rohit have the privilege. I must give opportunity to the hand that I had seen on the land. This side. Hari? Has it disappeared? Okay. Okay, Rashmi. Final one.
I'd like you to talk a little more about how schools can play their role in making competent democratic citizenship. Through what measures they do that, apart from teaching things like maybe civics or political studies. Is it in the management of the schools, the internal functioning of the schools, that students should get to play the role of democratic participants in managing an institution? Is that also not important? What is your view of that?
Okay. So I'll go in reverse order again, so I remember everything. So on that, it depends on the school and it depends on the kids who are in it. So I'll just give you an example. So in general, yes. I think it's much more than civics, much more than the academics. It has to do with how people operate within the school. But if you have a school so I have a friend who teaches at Harvard, and he says there are two kinds of student. There are students who think that they're more important than everybody else, and there are students who think they're not as important as everybody else. Now, how you treat the students who think they're not as important as everybody else is different from how you treat the students who think they're more important than anybody else, because they need to learn different lessons. The ones who don't think they're as important, and I have a lot of those students who don't think they're as important as everybody else, they need to learn that they are, right? And how you manage that and treat that is different from the ones who feel entitled and don't question their own privilege. They need to learn different lessons. So that's the first thing. Religious schools. Yeah, I mean, maybe this is just sort of a general worry. I was talking quickly, okay? Religious schools that are deeply sectarian can't, I think, play the role. They can't fulfill these public purposes. There are, in my experience, by and large, Church of England schools in the UK are open in the way that I would like them to be. In my experience, certain Catholic schools in the US are open in the way that I require. But plenty of schools are not. But also, plenty of non-religious schools are not. So plenty of non-religious schools in the US are not open about, they expect children to come in loving football and loving Coke and loving, capitalism, and they have them leave believing all that. And it's essentially, there's a commercial religion which they're expected to be part of, and they continue to be part of. So maybe religious schools are on average worse, less likely to be able to play the role. Maybe they're much less likely, and that's a contextual judgment. So that's, I don't want to open things up too much for them. So then my other comment, can I do one last comment, which I think answers both the questions, or at least so my answer to your question, where are you? Well, is no, I don't think so. So what I think is that you have to do what I did first, and then what you do is you think about whether education is the kind of good that is liable to work well in market situations. And I think that the answer to that is not a difficult one. So I think markets are inevitable. You're never going to get completely rid of markets, but I think markets are pretty much inimical to the realization of the goods of education. And exactly because it is a very different kind of good than, say, orange juice, right? And maybe it's just a difference in preference. Like, you prefer to do the thing that I prefer to do second first, and I prefer to do the thing that you want to do first second. the way my mind works is I start with what I did, and then I move on to what you're saying. And I think that helps with Rohit's worries. I mean, you're clearly. I think the principles are not going to. The deep first principles are not going to refer directly to institutions. They're not going to refer directly to institutional forms. You find the principles, and then you look at institutional forms, and you ask how likely those institutional forms are to serve the principles. I mean, that's what I do. Again, it's maybe a matter of preference, And yes, some institutional forms are going to be better, and some institutional forms are going to be worse. And I want to have that argument. But I also want to be very clear that, governments don't always do these things well either. My advice is don't give away the house. I don't know what my advice is because I don't know what the right metaphor is. But, my advice is no. Once you give things over to the private sector, it's really, really hard to get them back. And so just from a pragmatic point of view, the private sector in service of lots of public goods, even if you think it would be better right now than the government, should be resisted because once you've given it away to them, the government is never going to develop the competencies, or if it does try to develop the competencies, the private sector is going to lobby to try and prevent it from doing so. So I think I end up in maybe not exactly the same place as you, but not as far from you as you're worried that I might.
Okay. In fact, your question will require discussion later. Okay. Yeah, because you want to elaborate. Very good. I think we have been having two very creative presentations. I'm deliberately using the word creative presentation.
It's creative a way of saying I don't agree with them.
The debate where I left Gurpreet's discussion is unresolvable. And the similar debate in your presentation, which Rohit now has raised, Gurpreet has been able to find in this whole controversial terrain a path by talking about education from primary to, and she clearly said that there is no differentiation made, so she is using all. If it were only elementary, maybe she would have made a different presentation. This creative, it is both presentations are very stimulating, but they leave me with discomfort.
Good.
Yeah. And I think that's, I've been reflecting, and I think some reflection for you. If the subject were notion of private and public in an unequal society, looking for moving towards an egalitarian social order, which is the national goal. By using the word public, somehow the national goal or societal goal, that has been left out. So if that were the presentation, what I'm going to reflect in the next tea break is what would be different in your presentations, both, if the subject were that. Okay, I think for these creative presentations, they deserve a big hand.